Before I respond to the question, I'll just put a disclaimer out that what I'm sort of saying here reflect my personal views. It doesn't reflect the views of my trustees or TFL pension fund. So with sort of that out of the way, so what is just transition, and why should it be sort of important for for institutional investor, or for that matter, I guess for anyone. I think just transition, as the name says, I think everyone understand what transition is. So I'm not going to talk about that. It's the just part, which I think is depending on who you ask, you'll probably get different responses. But I think the way I understand about just transition, or the word just, it's about the fairness that when we talk about transition, some because it's going to have its costs and it also have its benefits. So the cost shouldn't disproportionately be sort of loaded on certain parts of the world, certain societies, or certain countries, or certain sectors, right? So that's to me is the fairness question. So in terms of how I think on the question of fairness, number one, it's about just the intergeneration element of fairness. That because as you know, 80% of the carbon that sits out there has come from 20% of the countries, by population. And then you can take Africa, 20% of the population, but in a cumulative term, they've contributed less than 1% to the problem. So now if you're trying to find solution to the problem, you need to sort of take that into account. Second is, forget the intergeneration part. Even if you look at how things stack up today, that number really hasn't changed. Like, so that number is no longer 80%. It's still somewhere about between 35 to 40%, again, coming from sort of 20% of the rich part of the world. And even there, Africa still 20%. It's no longer under 1%, but not too different. It's still about 2 to 3%. Right? So clearly there is, forget the intergeneration, even on a snapshot basis, there is this unfairness to any the solution. I think third one, as I think, is if we forget there were any country boundaries, and if we were to almost divide the world by how rich or poor we are, almost 10% of the richest in the world contribute more than 50% to the carbon footprint, and the poorest 50 contribute only 7%. Right. So clearly there is this sort of the economic or the fairness kind of an angle to this sort of the discussion, and then finally, and I think that's where it becomes quite real for the asset owners, when they think about how to sort of take this into account in their strategies. It's about thinking of their investment in just beyond risk and return terms. It's almost, so I think the way I find it quite useful is to use the Sustainable Development Goal framework. 17 of them, as I said, all 17 are not relevant, but clearly 5 are. And then it will involve trade-off, both in terms of actually implementation and also for our investments. And it's trying to get the sort of the balance right for the 5 things I've just listed. Those are the kind of things that any investor should sort of at least keep into sort of in their analysis, if it's not completely able to implement, but at least having that context is actually quite helpful as you're thinking of this from a kind of more strategic framework. If you're trying to implement this using the sort of the SDG framework with the kind of investments we make, one is just trying to get hang of the data, right? You can only make a decision, as they say, what get measured gets sort of managed. So I think you need some access to meaningful and reliable data for you to almost make those sort of the trade-offs quite transparent in your sort of the underwriting. It's there, but sort of not completely there, right? So data clearly sort of is one challenge. And I think the second is, even when sort of the data is there, at the end of the day, we're taking risks to generate returns. And I think returns in some of the more difficult jurisdictions, clearly, when I go back to my intergeneration kind of a framework, the locations probably which haven't contributed to the problem, but now are being asked to be part of the solution. And again, coming from almost as a kind of what role can a private capital or institutional capital can play in that. We have to think in risk terms. We can't isolate risk from our kind of underwriting. And I think that's where things like regulatory risk, political risk become sort of quite heightened in some of those jurisdictions. So despite our best willingness and sort of desire to do things, it just the risk return just doesn't stack up. And I think that's where probably, I think from a solution perspective, I think there's a role for some kind of a de-risking, whether it's from the multilateral de-risking or from the DFIs, I'm talking the World Banks and the IADB sort of the world, or even likes of DFID. I think that's where there has to be some kind of an institutional de-risking mechanism or the first law structures which allows our capital to actually play a kind of a meaningful role, because you're talking of trillions that's required, as part of this just transition, and money is just not there as things stand. So that's the challenge, and that's how I see one of many ways in which it can be addressed.